Canada's Challenge. It's time to rediscover our trading roots. Written and delivered by David Watts. Prime Minister Mark Carney is calling Canadians to increase trade with each other as we seek new partners abroad. To strengthen our presence overseas, we need to get our own act together so our outreach can be one of coordinates, not separate jurisdictions in competition. This is proving harder than we thought. Facing U.S. tariffs, we continue to cling to local interests, supply management, assured access for Western oil, and regional certification standards that make it difficult for workers to go where the jobs are and developing areas to quickly import skilled labor they need. The Memorandum of Understanding between Ottawa and Alberta is an attempt to encourage new starts without having to rewrite the whole regulatory framework. We've been here before, more than once. We first sought free trade with the U.S. after 1846, when Britain abandoned laws that had favored importation of our grain products. Governor General Elgin negotiated a treaty with the American Secretary of State for import of our raw materials to fill the gap created by loss of UK preference. Then the U.S. Senate canceled this after 12 years, forcing our provinces to trade with each other, giving impetus to Confederation. John A. Macdonald developed a national policy to build economic self-sufficiency in the new Dominion. 200 years before, another John, Intendant Jean Talon, had encouraged industries in New France to reduce dependency on products from the old France off the boat each spring. To the end of his life, Sir John A. fought efforts to renew free trade with the U.S. as a slippery slope to annexation. 20 years after Macdonald died, Liberal Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier proposed U.S. reciprocity again, and lost to the Conservatives. The issue lay dormant 77 years until Brian Mulroney's 1988 Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, the system that Trump tariffs and U.S. turning inward is now undoing. Post-contact Canada has been an economic satellite of one power after another for 400 years. Of France for 150. Britain 170, and the American Empire for the last 85. Do we have the will to process our own resources and sell finished products in more than one market? Or does fixation with easy access, quick supply, and lowest prices, like 1970s quick gas at the U.S. border, keep us as a dependent adult child with a trustee who gives us an allowance and pockets any increase in the value of our products as a finder's fee? This is what Prime Minister Carney is proposing, rather than putting all our eggs in one basket with a trustee to oversee our affairs. Before contact, there was a rudimentary, limited system of trade amongst First Nations bands and confederacies. On the plains, a bison-based culture traded surplus hides, buffalo robes, bone implements, byproducts such as pemmicans and sinew, with nations in fur-bearing forested areas for pelts, quills for beadwork, with obsidian, volcanic glass, and other minerals with nations from coastal mountains, and shells and derivative dyes from nations by the sea. When Europeans arrived on Hudson Bay and the St. Lawrence, metal objects were added to the mix, starting with Champlain firearms. Furs brought to trading posts sustained European fashions. There were periodic incursions into each other's territories, skirmishes, and warfare, but among First Nations and confederacies, trade continued on a stable basis, except when war between European powers upped the ante and they armed each other's indigenous allies. Trade was the bottom line on which relationships between peoples and distant empires was built. Fair trade value was compromised by giving liquor to indigenous people to weaken their shrewdness in bargaining. The addictive effect of alcohol, to which North American natives had not been exposed, contributed to the decline of their societies over generations. But in trying to address the facts of contact, we must remember that the first Europeans after the Vikings to reach Turtle Island did not come for settlement but circumnavigation. Their goal was trade with Asia, India, China, Japan, and the Spice Islands. Europeans had been trading with these for centuries, traveling overland until the Ottoman Empire closed the Silk Road through Asia. Before this closure, Venetian Marco Polo did settle in Cathay for a while, working in the service of the Emperor Kublai Khan. To do this, he had to fit in and observe the laws and customs of these other civilizations. There was no question of conquest. Their rulers showed interest in learning of the homelands of the European visitors once they'd proven themselves of use. 2 centuries after Marco Polo, Christopher Columbus persuaded Queen Isabella to equip 3 ships for contact with the Far East by crossing the Atlantic, before a doctrine of discovery sanctioned conquest or colonization. Would Columbus's cannon have enabled him to attack? Hardly. Gunpowder was invented by the Chinese. But not knowing how big Earth was, or other lands between Spain and his destination, and with no Starfleet prime directive to avoid interference in other societies, the stage was set for the destabilization of the Americas by Cortez and Pizarro. The north half of Turtle Island, what's now Canada, was less choice for takeover due to climate and topography. Cartier described the coast of Labrador as the land God gave to Cain, Cain's curse for the murder of his brother Abel. Hudson Bay was a tragic end for Henry Hudson, and what Martin Frobisher thought precious metal in the Arctic turned out to be fool's gold. These impressions show up in Voltaire's dismissing Canada as quelques hectares de neige, a few acres of snow. They played out in France's decision to cede Canada's wilderness for Guadeloupe's sugarcane after the 7 Years' War. With no quick riches, clear route to the Far East, an agricultural land like New England South, European visitors to what became Canada focused on 3 things. The cold water produced plentiful fish, the harsh land fur-bearing animals, and the forests timber for shipbuilding. Grand Banks cod became a protein staple, salted and dried and shipped to Europe each summer. Timber from the Canadas and New Brunswick supplied His Majesty's Navy as Britain became deforested. But what took the newcomers farther inland, eventually to the heart of the continent, was the fur trade. Fish and timber trades focused on their buyers' markets. Fur traders never forgot their original goal of finding the Western Sea en route to the Far East. The fur trade became a genuine partnership with First Nations, who brought pelts and trading posts. It created intimate partnerships as trader voyageurs married Indigenous women, who enabled them to survive on the land and parented the Métis people. New France traded west of Montreal through the lakes and rivers of Ontario and on to the south of the Western Plains. The Hudson's Bay Company traded with the shores of the bay farther west through the Saskatchewan, Peace, and Athabasca river systems into the Rocky Mountains. When Quebec passed to British rule, Scottish traders established the Northwest Company with French-Canadian voyageurs. After years of competition, the 2 companies merged. British and French traders had both opposed inland European settlement because it impinged on the land of their indigenous allies, impeded the flow of furs, and disturbed habitat of fur-bearing animals. The 1816 Seven Oaks Massacre in Manitoba, usually attributed to corporate rivalry, occurred when a director of one company tried to transplant impoverished Highlanders onto the Western Plains. After this, both companies saw settlement as incompatible with the fur trade, and it was not attempted again. This is not to ignore the truth that injustices did occur and colonization eventually won out. But it was not the plan of the first European explorers, traders, and missionaries on the scene. In fact, it was the ending of the Hudson's Bay Rupert's Land lease 150 years before collapse of the Hudson's Bay Company stores that led to an influx of English-speaking surveyors, speculators, and settlers from Ontario, and this precipitated the first Métis resistance led by Louis Riel. Likewise, creation of the Northwest Mounted Police and the march west of 300 on a horseback was to clear the plains not for settlement, but of whiskey traders from the U.S. whose firewater had inflamed relations among First Nations in the Cypress Hill Massacre. The red-coated Mounties gained First Nations trust because they had one law for Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. Northwester Alexander Mackenzie had reached the Pacific from Canada by land and wrote these words, his name, and the 1793 date on a rock by a fjord at Bella Bella, now in British Columbia. His approach to the mountains from the east followed a network of interconnecting streams and lakes that voyageurs and native guides had plied for generations. His descent of the Fraser River southward, through new territory of less friendly First Nations, would become the path of a transcontinental railway and the Trans-Canada Highway. But this was not in his mind in 1793. Canada was still something far to the east. Mackenzie had found the Western Sea, Champlain, La Vérendrye, and others had sought for generations, and before them mariners by sea. This was not nation-building, but finding a trade route around the world. With the Arctic blocked by ice, the Isthmus of Panama impassable until 1914, a railway across the western plains and connecting ships would become the Northwest Passage Europe had been seeking 400 years. 40 years after Mackenzie wrote his name on the rock by tidewater, Nova Scotian Joseph Howe was talking up a transcontinental railway. 50 years later, it was being built. But when Sir John A. Macdonald congratulated CP's president George Stephen on the last spike at Craigellachie in 1885, Stephen replied, "You must remember that Canadian Pacific will not be completed until we have reached Shanghai." Stephen was right. The funding to build what was then the world's longest railway would not have been available for a country of 3 million people living at one end. When we talk of the railway as nation building, we're missing the point. Investors didn't care whether British Columbia became part of Canada or not. Their interest was in the potential of global trade. That was realized 6 years later in 1891 when the Empress of India, Canadian Pacific's first steamship, arrived in Vancouver from India, Singapore, China, and Japan to inaugurate a Pacific service with 2 sister vessels. CP's Empresses became the fastest, finest ships on the Pacific, crossing more quickly than ships to San Francisco or Los Angeles, as the Earth's curvature made Vancouver closer to Asia. With this Great Circle route, and later Empresses on the Atlantic, CP offered a service carrying people, mail, teas, silks, and other commodities between Asia and Europe in less than a month. The railway was a portage between steel canoes on both oceans. Canada was a bridge for this trade, and the company's mantra became Canadian Pacific spans the world. This heritage, as a society of traders, Prime Minister Mark Carney now challenges us to reclaim. The talks that led to Confederation began after collapse of preferential trade with the UK, and then free trade with the US forced British North American colonies to trade with each other. Every time we've been tempted to cut short-term deals, it has come at long-term cost. Let's remember that as the wheel of fortune presents us with a new challenge and opportunity. Knowing of the trade by people who first lived here and by those who came later trying to get to more distant destinations can help us understand our borders. The next few episodes will look at the lines, natural and artificial, that demarcate and crisscross the northern half of North America. The half-continent that explorers thought was in the way of where they were going may turn out to be on the way the Kanata constellation is leading an awakening humanity. Stay tuned to see how our checkered past has laid the groundwork for this challenge and adventure. I'm David Watts.
120 years ago we labored on a dream to build a bridge to Asia from Cartier's machine, to span the seas with steel canoes, portage the land by rail, our ships and trains around the world in an age of steam and steel. But time dragged on and credit spent, the will began to wane, until we wondered if we'd hear the whistle of the train. And in the gloom a cablegram between two crusty Scots said we'll go down together with our line and give it all we've got. Stand fast, Gallagher, the true north strong and free. Stand fast, Gallagher, Dominion sea to sea. We'll build the Northwest Passage over Canada by land, and on the way a country the world can understand. The line went through and spanned the world, but still we could not rest. For in our own untamed expanse we faced another test. Our wealth, our place, our cultures began to stretch and strain, till other links took up the cry that once went with the train. Stand fast, Gallagher, we'll make ourselves anew. Stand fast, Gallagher, the message will go through. We'll be the Northwest Passage in a vast and varied land, or Canada, a meeting place the world will understand. The word's gone out and now our world is growing to be one. Yet other lines divide and so our work is far from done. The borders fall but barriers rise between the rich and poor. And so to all who will listen, the cry goes out once more. Stand fast, Gallagher, around our planet Earth. Stand fast, Gallagher, no matter where our birth. We've built a global village in our vast and untamed land, for we're the Northwest Passage that the world can understand. Stand fast, Gallagher.
Just one time I would take the Northwest Passage to find the hand of Franklin reaching for the Beaufort Sea, tracing one warm line through a land so wide and savage, and make a Northwest Passage to